Today we start topic 6, the age of imperialism. Imperialism is when a more powerful nation takes over a weaker nation in order to use it for its natural resources or to provide markets. So let's take a look at it. So what was the need? The need for imperialism. Well, they wanted resources, especially with industrialization. The need for rubber, the need for oil, like petroleum oil, but even palm oil to grease machinery. Plus now these consumer nations, now that middle class was growing in the industrial time period, they wanted products like coffee or chocolate. There were also political and military motives. There was an American admiral by the name of Alfred T. Mahan who wrote a book about the importance of naval power. You need a strong navy if you're going to be a very powerful country. And so to have a strong navy, you need ports all over the world, places they can stop and refuel, pick up coal, pick up fresh food. So to project your power, you need ports. And then there's nationalism. Having colonies was seen as kind of like a status symbol of being a great power. So we need to have colonies. It even leads the United States into it, although we didn't call them colonies. You have humanitarian religious motives. So we need to get out there and spread medicine. These poor people, they don't have clean drinking water. They're dying of diseases that are easily preventable. So we, as the more advanced society, and I mean Europe and North America, we need to help our fellow man. And then, of course, we have to spread the rule of law. The backwards, kind of archaic systems like chopping off somebody's hand for stealing or even slavery, which was still in exist. We have to spread the rule of law. And then there's Christian motives. Christian missionaries were going out to spread God's word. So a lot of this had to do with social Darwinism. You probably know a little bit about Charles Darwin and his survival of the fittest. Well, the white race, meaning the United States so much and definitely Europe, they had a duty. They were honor bound as being the superior race to help out those who weren't as advanced. And so Rudyard Kipling, who was a British author, wrote a poem that was called The White Man's Burden. And it kind of gave its name to this social Darwinist concept that we need to help out those less fortunate. And there was even some like quack experiments in the 1800s that just showed the superiority of the white race. So what types of imperial rule? Well, there was direct. And what that means is these European powers placed their administrators in positions of governing. They brought over governors, civil servants. The French were pretty, that was pretty much their predominant way of governing. The British used more indirect, where they would bring over some British governors and officials, but they'd leave like local administrators in place. The other thing the British liked to do was called a protectorate, where they would leave, for instance, some Raj prince of India, one of the Indian kingdoms or principalities, in place. It's like, hey, you can still be the prince of wherever, but we're going to station a British advisor in your court, and you would be wise to listen to what he tells you. So they kind of control the local leaders. And then countries in Europe would carve out what they called their spheres of influence, meaning this area of the world, we have exclusive trading rights. Nobody else should be in there. And that was really prevalent, as the map is showing you up there, in China. What were the effects? Well, borders were changed. So for instance, let's look at Africa. Yeah, I always get amazed when I'm teaching Africa, and a lot of my students are like, Africa's a country. No, it's about 48 countries. It's probably more than that now. It's probably like 49 or 50. And each one is different. But who drew the borders? The Europeans. So let me give you a good example. The British drew the borders of Nigeria. Most Nigerians don't think of themselves, oh, I'm Nigerian. They think of themselves more along their tribal ethnicities. So you might be a Hausa or a Fulani who actually get along decently, or a Yoruba or an Igbo. who don't get along. And the Yoruba and Igbo don't get along with the Hausas and Fulanis. But because that was kind of a British sphere of influence and the British took it over as a colony, they named it Nigeria. So throughout, especially Africa, when you look at it, there's a lot of issues inside the country because the British drew the borders of these countries, or the French, or even Germans in some instances. And then, of course, the laws that were changed. They now went by more Western laws, which was oftentimes very, very different from their traditional methods. And then the Europeans forced cash crops on them. So, for instance, in Egypt, they wanted them to grow cotton to feed the British textile mills. Well, you can't eat cotton. Or they would exploit them for their minerals. Like South Africa was very rich in things like diamonds or iron deposits, things like that. So they would take those out. And what you had now is, instead of a barter economy, is the growth of money economy, meaning you had to pay taxes in money, or you had to pay money to acquire the goods you needed to survive, which previously that wasn't always the case. One of the big changes, especially in Africa, was the movement of workers. So a lot of men would take off and go work in the mines. A lot of rural communities would go to the cities, which really led to urbanization. And they'd leave women behind. So oftentimes women wouldn't see their husband for a year. They'd come back, inevitably get pregnant, be gone. The woman would have to go through pregnancy by herself, have the kid, and then her husband would come home, meet his new kid, and start the process all over again. And then Christian missionaries, which were really trying to change their way of life, even the way they dressed. A good example was the Polynesian women, especially in Hawaii. They dressed, well, it's very hot. They didn't dress wearing a lot of clothes. And when the Christian missionaries came, they invented the muumuu. And if you know what the muumuu is, it's like this big, not very form-fitting dress that's very flowery. Anyway, so they changed a lot about how they lived their lives. Now, it's not all bad. In fact, you could argue maybe if it weren't for just feeling like a second-class citizen in your own nation, there was a lot of good. The biggest one is transportation. The railroads, the roads, connecting cities via shipping. This wasn't around before. In fact, if you look at these countries in Asia, like India, or Africa, the railroads built by the British, they're still used today. Medicine, that's a big one. Hospitals, sanitary conditions, running water. All this is a big advantage of colonialism. And then, of course, the jobs they provided. In fact, one of the good ones is, for instance, in what today is the Ivory Coast, people began to grow things like chocolate, cacao trees, or coffee, and it provided them with added income that normally they wouldn't have had. So there are some advantages, but they don't outweigh the disadvantages. So previously, prior to imperialism, the Africans lived in some small states, various communities based along tribal lines. Congo is a good example. For the Europeans, they knew about the coastal regions, but they didn't go into the interior, mainly because they died of African diseases, which were mosquito-borne, like yellow fever or malaria. But the improvement in medicine, especially quinine, which was made out of a bark off a tree, allowed the Europeans to penetrate into the interior of Africa and Asia. Anyway, what really captured Europe's imagination was the story of Daniel Livingston and Henry Stanley. Daniel Livingston was a British missionary who wanted to go into the heart of Africa. And he kind of disappeared. For over a year, nobody knew. Is he alive? Is he dead? Because no European had ever been there. So an American newspaper commissioned a reporter, Henry Stanley, to go look for him. And he ends up, exploring and writing in the newspaper articles every week, submitting them. Anyway, he comes to a lake in the middle of Africa, what today is around Congo, Burundi, Rwanda region. And he sees a white man, and he walks up and says, Dr. Livingston, I presume. And this kind of caught the world, and I mean the industrialized world, attention that we need to get into Africa. Um, as I mentioned, racism was a big part of it. That's the white man's burden. I already hit social Darwinism. And forces enabling imperialism is really industrialization, uh, improvements in medicine, and wealth. So those are the big ones. So there was a mad scramble for Africa. And eventually, Germany's kind of like a late player in the game because as we went over the last chapter, Germany isn't even Germany till 1870. And by then, Britain and France had grabbed most of the best parts. So the Germans are trying to get their share because, you got to be, you got to have colonies to be a great power. So they held a conference in Berlin to kind of set ground rules. And what they said at the Berlin conference is any European nation that can claim occupation and notifies the rest of Europe that that's their zone of influence can have that as a colony. Again, not taking any Africans' considerations into account. So everybody wanted the raw materials, and that's what they were after. Now, the Zulus were a very powerful Bantu tribe in southern Africa, and what today is South Africa. And around the 1820s, they began consolidating under a great ruler by Shaka, who combined the people in age regiments. And he would use what would be known as the Mfakane, which means the hammering, to smash all the other Bantu tribes in that region. And what that did is it opened up a lot of South Africa, which is like California, very temperate, to when the Boers, who were Dutch farmers, would move into this region, thinking it's unpopulated. But it was because the Zulus had hammered the other tribes out of it. When a Boer found diamonds in that region, the British kind of followed the Boers there, and that led to the Boer War. The Boer War was kind of a white-on-white war. It was the Dutch farmers, the Boers, against the British. See, the British didn't like the way the Boers treated the native Africans. The British had already gotten rid of slavery, and to the British it was kind of like slavery. So the Boers had gone on what was called the Great Trek into the interior, north into South Africa, where they clashed with the Zulus and they found diamonds, and the British would start the Boer War to kind of bring that area under their control. The Boers actually used guerrilla tactics, hit and run. You see a picture of Boer guerrillas. But the British won the war basically by rounding up the Boer women and children and putting them in concentration camps where many starved. So the Boers would end up surrendering. All right, we'll stop with that.